Okay, so this is our continuing discussion of Simondon's individuation in the light of notions of form and information. We're on part 2, chapter 1, section 1, and we're just towards the end of subsection 1, starting from page 175 of the translation. So last time we saw the beginning of the chapter was about this sort of three-way relationship that Simondon sees in vital individuation, so the individuation of living beings. So there's these three functions or three activities that make up vital individuation. There's differentiation and integration, which are sort of complementary activities. There's a living being integrates lower level organizations within its own organization, but it also differentiates them. So a living being is, at the same time as it integrates organization within it, it also differentiates itself into a lower level organization. So there's these two levels or two directions of relationship between the levels of organization within a living being. And then those two activities or two functions of integration and differentiation are themselves related to each other through this third function, which is a little bit mysterious, the transductive function. So this function both unites and separates the other two functions. So the three together make up this triality of the living being. The first bit of the chapter was about the relationship between physical individuation and vital individuation, but then he almost immediately goes on to talk about psychic individuation, which is a further stage of the individuation process or a further level of individuation. So he's kind of giving us like the big picture, or he's skipping through all the intermediate steps to get to show us the whole progression, and then he's going to zoom in on the intermediate steps afterwards and look more in detail at vital individuation. And so I think the last bit we saw was on how affectivity has this polar quality to it. Affectivity in the living being is always related to some sort of polarization of qualities like light and dark or hot and cold. And this affectivity is always related to some sort of action in relation to this polarization. So either directed towards light or away from light, or towards warmth or away from warmth, and so on. And this polarization or polar quality of affectivity means that it can give sense to something like a negativity or a lack. The absence of light is not just a purely negative, a lack of a quality, but it itself has a quality of its own, namely darkness. So it's only in relation to this kind of polarization in affectivity that you can have a sense in which the lack of one quality can take on the form of the presence of the opposite quality. So that's about where we left off last time. And so we're going to pick up from the sentence, the fundamental type. Let me just find that. The fundamental type of vital transduction is the temporal series, which is both integrative and differentiating. The identity of a living being is composed of its temporality. An error could be made by conceiving temporality as a pure differentiation, as the necessity of an ongoing and renewed choice. Individual life is differentiation to the extent that it is integration. Here there is a complementary relation that cannot lose one of its two terms without itself ceasing to exist by transforming into a false differentiation, which is in reality an aesthetic activity through which, within a dissociated personality, each choice is known as a choice by way of the subject's consciousness and becomes an information to be integrated, whereas it was an energy to be differentiated. Choice is what is chosen, more so than the object of the choice. The affective orientation loses its relational capacity within a being whose choice constitutes the whole relational activity, which in some sense comes to support itself through its own reactivity. The choice must be conspicuously discontinuous to represent a veritable differentiation. A continuous choice in a subject that is conscious of the fact that it chooses is in reality a mixture of choice and information. From this simultaneity and from the information results the elimination of the element of discontinuity characteristic of action. An action mixed with information by this type of recurrence actually becomes a mixed existence, simultaneously continuous and discontinuous, quantum, proceeding through abrupt leaps that introduce a reversal in consciousness. This type of action cannot end up in a veritable constructive affectivity, but merely in a precarious stability in which an illusion of choice is produced by a recurrence that ends in oscillations of relaxation. Relaxation differs from the constructive choice insofar as choice never links the subject back to previous states, whereas relaxation periodically relates the subject back to a neutral state that is the same as the previous neutral states. A sentiment such as that of the empty absurd, which we seek to distinguish from the mysterious absurd, precisely corresponds to this state of a return to nothingness in which each reactivity or recurrence is abolished by an absolute inactivity and absence of information. That is because in this neutral state, activity leads to an increase in the value of information, and the absence of activity causes a complete lack of information. If elements of information are then presented as coming from the outside, then they are abandoned as absurd because they are without value. They are not qualified because the subject's direct affectivity no longer performs and has been replaced by a recurrence of information and action. This existence is the feature of every aestheticism. The subject in the state of aestheticism is a subject that has replaced its affectivity with a reactivity of action and information according to a closed cycle that is incapable of accepting a new action or a new information. In a certain sense, aestheticism could be treated as a vicarious function of affectivity, but aestheticism destroys the recourse to affectivity by constituting a type of existence that eliminates the circumstances in which a veritable action or a veritable information could arise. The temporal series is replaced by a series of cyclochronic units that succeed one another without being continuous and that carry out a closure of time according to an iterative rhythm. Every artificiality that renounces the creative aspect of vital time becomes a condition of aestheticism, even if this aestheticism does not utilize the construction of the object to carry out the return of causality from action to information, and is more simply content with a recourse to an action that iteratively modifies the conditions of grasping the world. Yeah, these pages are a little bit obscure. I'm not sure exactly what he has in mind when he talks about this aestheticism. It sounds like he's thinking of something precise, but I'm just not familiar with what exactly that is. But to the extent that we can make sense of this, there's I guess, an attitude in which we have, maybe we can compare this to something like existentialism, in which there's a sort of experience of the world as fundamentally absurd, and then there's the necessity for this pure choice, where each of the options chosen is meaningless in itself, and so the choice is a sort of choice among equally meaningless options, and in that sense, the choice is, as Simondon says, it's choosing the choice itself rather than choosing any one of those particular options. So there's this relationship between the absurdity, or this experience of absurdity, and the way that choice has this purely formal character. And I think this is sort of along the lines of what he's describing as aestheticism, the way that this, rather than having this affective relationship to the different options chosen, there's this purely formal relationship to the different options and to the environment. So any option that presents itself, or any element of the environment that would perhaps be the goal of an action, or would be acted upon, presents itself as meaningless. Because of that, there's this lack of affectivity, those two, the lack of affectivity and the meaninglessness of the environment are sort of coordinate with each other. And so there's this form of this mode of existence, I guess, is one in which the affectivity disappears and is replaced by this purely formal choice between meaningless options. I think that's the big picture of what he's talking about here. And then he also mentions, or he brings up the relationship of this aestheticism to time. And so under this aesthetic mode of existence, or aestheticist mode of existence, each action is sort of self-contained and equally meaningless. There's no underlying structure or unifying structure that leads from one action to the next, or that unites one action with the next one. So under this mode of existence, time takes the form of a series of discontinuous moments rather than having some sort of unity like affectivity gives to time. So when a living being has that polarization that's characteristic of affectivity, there's some sort of permanent structure or some sort of permanent relationship between the two poles and the activities that take place between those two poles. So an action is structured by its relationship to one of those poles versus the other one, and succeeding actions are likewise structured by that same polarization, which is the fundamental structure of affectivity. So that permanent structure of affectivity gives unity to the living being as a subject through time. Okay, so let's go on to the next subsection, which is a short one, just a couple pages, but would someone else like to read?
Subsection 2, successive levels of individuation, vital, psychical, transindividual. How is the psychical distinguished from the vital? According to this theory of individuation, the psychical and the vital are not distinguished as two substances or even as two parallel or superposed functions. The psychical intervenes as a slowing down of the individuation of the living, a neotenic amplification of the first state of this genesis. The psyche exists when the living being does not completely become concretized and conserves an initial duality. If the living being could be entirely pacified and satisfied in itself with what it is as an individuated individual, within its somatic limits and through its relation to the milieu, there would be no appeal to the psyche. But instead of having the capacity to overlay and unify the duality of perception and action, it is when life becomes parallel to an ensemble composed by perception and action that the living being problematizes itself. All the problems of the living being cannot be resolved by the simple transductivity of regulative affectivity. When affectivity can no longer intervene as a power of resolution, when it can no longer carry out this transduction, which is an individuation perpetuated within the already individuated living being, affectivity gives up its central role in the living being and becomes situated alongside the perceptive active functions. A perceptive active problematic and an affective emotional problematic then suffuse the living being. The appeal to psychical life is like a slowing down of the living being, which conserves this slowing down in an extended and metastable state rich in potentials. The essential difference between simple life and the psyche consists in the fact that affectivity does not perform the same role in these two modes of existence. In life, affectivity has a regulative value. It dominates the other functions and guarantees this ongoing individuation that is life itself. In the psyche, affectivity is pressed on all sides. It poses problems instead of resolving them and leaves the problems to the perceptive active functions, the problems of the perceptive active functions unresolved. The entrance into psychical existence essentially manifests as the appearance of a new problematic which is higher and more difficult, and which cannot receive any veritable solution from within the living being, properly speaking, conceived within its limits as an individuated being. Psychical life is therefore neither a prompting nor a higher rearrangement of the vital functions that continue to exist under it and with it, but a new plunge into pre-individual reality followed by a more primitive individuation. Between the life of the living being and the psyche, there is the interval of a new individuation. The vital is not a matter for the psychical. It is not necessarily taken up again and resumed by the psyche, for the vital already has its own organization, and the psyche can do nothing but disrupt it by attempting to intervene in it. A psyche that attempts to be constituted by dealing with the vital and by taking it as a matter in order to give it a form merely ends up with malformations and an illusion of functionality.
Yeah, so there's a footnote there that is interesting as well. I don't know if anyone has the PDF with the footnotes on hand, but so what it says, I'll just sort of translate it on the fly here. But so there's the footnote where he first introduces the idea of this psychic individuation as another level of individuation, and he says, this does not mean that there are merely living beings and other others that are living and thinking. It is probable that animals also find themselves sometimes in a psychic situation. Only these situations which lead to acts of thinking are less frequent in animals. Man having the possibilities, having more extensive psychic possibilities, in particular, thanks to the resources of symbolism, more often makes use of the psyche, of the psyche, I guess. It is the purely vital situation that is exceptional in man, and for which he feels himself to be least prepared. But there is not there something like a nature, an essence that would permit to found an anthropology. Simply, a threshold is crossed. The animal is better equipped to live than to think, and man to think than to live. But one and the other, both one and the other, live and think either regularly or exceptionally. So what that footnote, I think, shows is sort of extends what's expressed in the text itself. So the psychic individuation is not something sort of extra added on top of vital individuation. It's a sort of it's already inherent in vital individuation, but it's a sort of problematizing of that vital individuation. So it's in the same way that vital individuation was a slowing down of physical individuation, in the same way psychic individuation is a slowing down of vital individuation. So rather than allowing that process of individuation to complete itself, it sort of intervenes and prevents the completion of the process of vital individuation. And yeah, so Angus, I think that's right, that so he characterizes this relationship, or he denies that the relationship between the psychic and the vital can be understood in terms of a matter and form relationship, so that the vital would be the matter and then the psyche would be the form that sort of is superposed on top of it. And then he suggests that any psyche that attempts to impose itself on the vital in that way as a form onto a matter will result in malformations and an illusion of functioning, which is a little bit obscure, but maybe we can think of this as a mode of existence, a psychic mode of existence in which the mind would be, or the psyche would be conceived as something sort of independent from the body, as the body representing the vital individuation, and then the mind as something independent that is sort of superposed upon it. I think something along those lines is what he has in mind here, but yeah, it is a bit obscure. And I think maybe another important point to highlight here is the way that psychic individuation is a new individuation. So it has to, in order for a living being to undergo psychic individuation, it has to sort of re-submerge itself into the pre-individual. It has to draw from the pre-individual again. So it's not just that the vital individuation and its results in a living being has something else added on to it. It has to sort of go back to the pre-individual and then individuate itself all over again in this new way that has this psychic character rather than a purely vital character. Yeah, this idea of superposition. Can we characterize Spinoza's account of the mind as being one like this, the one that Simondon is criticizing here? Yeah, I would be a little bit wary of making that sort of identification. So on the one hand, you're right that there is a sort of the mind for Spinoza is sort of is external to the body or to extended, but at the same time, the mind for Spinoza is the idea of the body. So it's integrated in some way, or it has this connection, which is a little bit obscure in Spinoza, of being the idea of. So there's this relationship between the body and the mind for Spinoza that is kind of hard to account for on his theory, because mind and body belong to two different modes. So there shouldn't be any sort of relationship between them in the proper sense. But yeah, so I think I would probably not make that exact identification of this superposition account with Spinoza. I think maybe Descartes is a better comparison because for him, the mind-body connection is much less direct. There's the mind and the body are distinct substances that have some relation to each other, but one that human beings can't really grasp. It has something to do with the pineal gland, but that's about all that Descartes gives us. So there's this obscure relationship, but in general, there's a distinction, a substantial distinction. So a distinction between two different substances, which are the mind and the body for Descartes. Okay, so we can go on to the next page or so if someone else would like to read.
In fact, the veritable psyche appears when the vital functions can no longer resolve the problems posed to the living being, i.e., when this triadic structure of perceptive, active, and effective functions is no longer able to be utilized. The psyche appears, or at the very least is postulated, when the living being no longer has enough being in itself to resolve the problems posed to it. It should not be surprising to find purely vital motivations at the basis of psychical life, but it should be noted that they exist as problems and not as guiding or determining forces. Thus, they do not exert a constructive determinism onto the psychical life that they call upon to exist. They provoke it, but do not positively condition it. The psyche appears as a new stage of the being's individuation, whose correlative in the being is an incompatibility and a decreasing supersaturation of vital dynamisms. And outside the being is a limited individual. A recourse to a new charge of pre-individual reality is capable of bringing a new reality to the being. The living individuates more precociously, and it cannot individuate by being its own matter to itself, like the larva that metamorphoses by feeding off itself. The psyche expresses the vital and, correlatively, a certain charge of pre-individual reality. Such a conception of the rapport between vital individuation and psychical individuation leads to representing the existence of the living being as playing the role of a source for psychical individuation, but not the role of a matter relative to which the psyche would be a form. Moreover, such a conception requires the following hypothesis to be posited. Individuation does not follow a law of all or nothing. It can occur in a quantum way by sudden leaps, and an initial stage of individuation leaves around the constituted individual associated with it a certain charge of pre-individual reality, which can be called associated nature, and which is still rich in potentials and organizable forces. Thus, when the psychical appears, there is a relation between the vital and the psychical that is not a relation of matter to form, but of individuation to individuation. Psychical individuation is a dilation, a precocious expansion of vital individuation.
So again, we have this idea of psychic individuation as this sort of precocious stage of vital individuation, so that it prevents vital individuation from completing itself. So this is the sense in which psychic individuation doesn't condition. So it serves as the basis or the source of of psychic individuation, but it doesn't condition it. So vital individuation poses problems that psychic individuation has to resolve, but it doesn't determine it in some sort of direct sense. And I think it's also worth highlighting again the way that psychic individuation has to draw from the pre-individual again. So there's something beyond the already constituted individual that has to be incorporated into the psychic individuation process. So there's what we would call the mind or the psyche is not something limited to the already constituted vital individual, living individual. It's something that incorporates a pre-individual aspect of the environment within itself, which I think is a very intriguing idea of the mind, which has not really been developed very much, or hasn't really been taken up in other philosophy of mind or philosophy in general. So yeah, the question in the chat here from Angus, is there something like an excess of the pre-individual? Does psychic individuation result from an excess of the pre-individual? And yeah, making connection with Bekai. I'm not sure if excess is exactly the right notion here. So if there's an incompletion, I guess, is maybe how I would put it. So that the vital individuation doesn't run its full course. It doesn't sort of finalize itself into a living individual in these contexts where affectivity is not sufficient to resolve the problem. So in these particular contexts, you have something like a second order individuation or another layer of individuation that draws from the pre-individual within the environment, but it's a result of the this incapacity of affectivity to deal with this particular problem in this context. So I'm not sure. I don't think excess is exactly the right term to use for the relationship between the pre-individual and psychic individuation. And then the other question from TL. So is this a reference back to the is this reference back to the pre-individual for the psychical different from the concept of the usia or essence, or that which is essential to associate the prior to the present? I'm just trying to think back. I mean, Simondon doesn't really use the term essence very much, or that's not sort of one of his key terminology choices. But what we were talking about earlier in relation to the way that affectivity is necessary to give unity to time, or unity to a subject through time, and in the aesthetic or aestheticist mode of existence, there's this lack of unity because there's a lack of affectivity. So if you're thinking something along those lines, I would say that yes, the reference back to the pre-individual is different. The unity of time is what Simondon characterizes as a transductive unity. So it's and he describes time as the first transduction. So it's a sort of process that extends itself progressively across a previously unstructured domain and brings about a structuration. In the same way, you have time sort of progressively becomes structured, so that in the way that the future is unstructured and the past has a structure to it, or a determination, I guess you could say, and the present serves as the sort of limit across which that structuration happens. And So that's the notion of the unity of time, this transductive unity of time. But the relationship to the pre-individual is a sort of a different set of concepts. We can think of it as sort of orthogonal to the flow of time, I guess, because for Simondon, time itself is something that has a genesis, so it's something that undergoes an individuation process, and so we can think of the relationship between the pre-individual and the psychical as a relationship of something like ontological priority or fundamentalness or something like that. So the pre-individual is the ground for the psychical, but there isn't something like a time relationship between them. One isn't prior to the other in time. Yeah, so I hope that sort of addresses the question. Maybe we can go on to the next page or so, and I can read the next bit. What results from such a hypothesis is that the entrance into the path of psychical individuation forces the individual being to surpass itself. The psychical problematic, which calls upon pre-individual reality, results in functions and structures that are not achieved within the limits of the living individuated being. If the living organism is called individual, the psychical leads to an order of trans-individual reality. Indeed, the pre-individual reality associated with individuated living organisms is not segmented like them and does not have limits comparable to those of separate living individuals. When this reality is grasped within a new individuation initiated by the living being, it conserves a relation of participation that connects each psychical being to other psychical beings. The psychical is the nascent trans-individual. For a certain amount of time, it can appear as the pure psychical, an ultimate reality that would consist in itself. But the living cannot borrow the potentials that produce a new individuation from the associated nature without entering into an order of reality that makes it participate in an ensemble of psychical reality which surpasses the limits of the living. Psychical reality is not self-enclosed. The psychical problematic cannot be resolved in an intra-individual way. Emergence into psychical reality is an emergence into a transitory path, since the resolution of the intra-individual psychical problematic, that of perception and that of affectivity, leads to the level of the trans-individual. The complete structures and functions resulting from the individuation of the pre-individual reality associated with the living individual are only accomplished and stabilized in the collective. Psychical life goes from the pre-individual to the collective. A psychical life that would like to be intra-individual would not be able to overcome a fundamental disparation between the perceptive problematic and the affective problematic. The psychical being, i.e. the being that achieves as completely as possible the functions of individuation by not limiting individuation to this first stage of the vital, resolves the disparation of its internal problematic to the extent that it participates in the individuation of the collective. This collective, which is a trans-individual reality obtained by the individuation of the pre-individual realities associated with the plurality of living beings, is distinguished from the pure social and from the pure inter-individual. The pure social indeed exists in animal societies. In order to exist, it does not require a new individuation that expands upon vital individuation. It expresses the manner in which living beings exist in society. Vital unit is literally what is directly social. Information that is attached to social structures and functions, for example, the functional differentiation of individuals in the organic interdependence of animal societies, is lacking in individuated organisms qua organisms. This society supposes as a condition of existence the structural and functional heterogeneity of different individuals in society. On the contrary, the trans-individual collective groups together homogeneous individuals. Even if these individuals present some heterogeneity, it's only to the extent that they have a basic homogeneity that they are grouped together as a collectivity, and not insofar as they are complementary with respect to one another in a superior functional unity. Society and trans-individuality can also exist by being superposed in the group, just as the vital and the psychical are superposed in individual life. The collective is distinguished from the inter-individual insofar as the inter-individual does not necessitate a new individuation in the individuals in which it is instituted, but merely a certain regime of reciprocity and exchanges that suppose analogies between intra-individual structures without challenging individual problematics. The birth of the inter-individual is progressive and does not suppose the interaction of emotion, the capacity of the individuated being to provisionally disindividuate in order to participate in a broader individuation. Interindividuality is an exchange between individuated realities that remain in their same level of individuation, and that seek in other individuals an image of their own existence, parallel to this existence. The addition of a certain coefficient of interindividuality to a society can give the illusion of transindividuality, but the collective only truly exists if an individuation institutes it. It is historical. So he's continuing with the sort of survey that he's started previously, where he starts from the relationship between physical and vital individuation. Then he passes almost immediately on to the relationship between vital individuation and psychical individuation. And then he's pointing towards the next level beyond that, which is the trans individual. And so each of these levels of individuation sort of inherently leads to the next one. So there's not like sort of a compartmentalization of one sort of isolated from the next one or something like that. They lead through something like the inherent development of each one. They lead to the next one. And so here we see the way that psychical individuation leads immediately into the trans individuation. And he distinguishes this from the social, which has to do with heterogeneity between different individuals. So I think what he's thinking of in particular is social insects, like bees or termites. So in that case, you have differentiation of the insects into what are known as castes. So you have bees, for example, there are workers, and then there's the queen and the drones, and they have morphological differentiation. So they have a different form of their bodies are different, and the total beehive or the total collective of these individual differentiated insects. It's a collectivity of heterogeneous individuals. So that it's only through the combination of all of their different functions that something like a total form of life arises. So they're dependent on the other counterparts within the hive in order to survive and reproduce and so on. So that's a society in the specific sense Simondon wants to use it. And the trans individual, on the other hand, is a relation between homogeneous individuals, or between individuals insofar as they are homogeneous. So within human societies, there is some sort of differentiation between different social roles, through the division of labor and so on. So there is a certain respect in which human societies are similar to insect societies, in that they have this differentiation. But then at the same time, there's also a respect in which human societies are not like those insect societies, because there's something like a homogeneity or a universality to human beings in a way that there isn't with these insects that are specialized for one particular function within their hive. So the trans individual is this collectivity, or is the level of individuation in the collective through this homogeneity. He also distinguishes, the trans individual from society, and then he also distinguishes it from the inter-individual, so that an inter-individual relationship would be something that exists between already constituted individuals. So there's something like exchange of goods between one person and another. would be something inter-individual. But the trans-individual level of individuation is precisely a new form of individuation. So in forming a collectivity of this kind, it's not just a gathering of already constituted individuals. There's some sort of new process of individuation that brings about this collectivity. So we have to distinguish, on the one hand, the trans individual from society, and then on the other hand, we have to distinguish it from the merely inter-individual. So the trans individual is sort of in between those two extremes, I guess. And then another point on the trans individual is this term disparation, which he introduces here. He doesn't really define it or anything, but he's talked about this a couple of times, and I think he goes into more detail later on in this part. But the term disparation is taken from the psychology of vision, and it refers to the difference in the retinal images on the two in your two eyes. So in binocular vision, there's a slightly different image which is produced on each retina, but your experience of the world is not of two separate images, but rather of a single world that has depth to it. So there's something like a problem, which is the difference between these two images, or the disparation between the two images, and it's resolved by introducing a new dimension of depth into experience or into the psychical life. And Simondon takes this as a sort of paradigm of how problem solving works in general, and so problem solving is not limited to something that like a thinking agent does, but we can characterize a process of individuation as solving a problem as well. There's something like a disparation or a problem within psychical life that the trans individual solves by developing this new dimension of the collective, and the collective overcomes the disparation or the problem that inheres in psychical life. Yeah, and Angus has posted in the chat a link to a story about social life in plants, which seems to be similar to social life of insects, for example, in the way that there's this functional differentiation of the different members of a plant society. They differentiate themselves, and the group relies on this differentiation so that each individual within that group performs a partial function, and they sort of combine together to make each individual able to survive and reproduce itself. And I think that's characteristic of plant societies in general. There's a differentiation of roles similarly to the way that there is in insect societies, but I'm certainly not an expert on plant social life, and I think that's an area that has only fairly recently been investigated. But yeah, it's a pretty cool side of biology.
According to my understanding is that the collective individuation, collectivity derives from like psychic individuation or psychical individuation, which I understand like individual level, on the individual level, individuation happens. I mean, takes place, and then it moves to the collective individuation. So my understanding is that collectivity is composed of each individual's individuation, or it reflects, collectivity reflects each individual's psychic individuation. And in this sense, collectivity of a society or community shows each individuals like in reality the collectivity is not like a equal level, equal amounts or equal quality of psychic individuation. What I mean is like each individual may contribute to forming collectivity, but in terms of the power or the extent of contribution or to the power of the or to the amount of collectivity, that could be different. I mean, that's the reality. So if in terms of Michel Foucault, like in terms of power in society, it could be totally different. So in terms of like the Simondonian idea, like collectivity is like the sum of or how do I say accumulation of the psychic individuation. But in reality, the amount of influence of the quality influence could be different. I hope like my kind of my question like sounds clear.
Yeah, I think I understand. So the question is, or the I guess the observation that you're making is that within human societies there is a different degree of influence of particular human individuals on the individuation of the collective. So they don't, not all human beings have the same capacity within existing human societies to affect the way that the collective individuation is carried out. Yeah, I think that's true. That's correct. But I think the way Simondon would understand that is human social formations are a mixture of all three of these concepts or all three of these structures that Simondon is identifying. So within human groupings, there's one aspect that is a society in the specific sense Simondon wants to use that term in. So there's a differentiation of roles within human group. So the individuals are grouped insofar as they're heterogeneous, insofar as they have different functions or different activities. But there's also, and then there's also something like an inter-individual aspect to human groupings. So like any group of humans has something like exchange of goods from one individual to another. But it's that third kind of the third kind of reality of the human group is the one that Simondon is interested in here. So it's not just a sort of assemblage of pre-existing individuals, and it's also not a differentiation into functional roles, but it's this new form of individuation. So it's the way that humans undergo a further individuation process in bringing about something like the collective. So, and I think it's important here that that last line of this subsection, when he says that the collective only truly exists if an individuation institutes it, it is historical. So this collective or this trans-individual level of individuality is not something that always exists. It's something that is brought about historically in particular times and places, so that you have to, it's something that has to be brought about through an active process of individuation. So given human groupings or empirically existing groups of humans don't necessarily have this trans-individual character, or this, they aren't necessarily collectives in the specific sense Simondon was using that term. Yeah, so this form of the collective is something that it's a historical accomplishment. It's something that requires an actual process of individuation to bring it about.
Yeah, thank you so much. Like, yeah, your explanation makes my kind of like the part that I was not able to understand like clear. So the thing is that the two things, like one is maybe like an individual would have different kind of capacity from by nature, like crystal. If I say it right, like a crystal or the key of the pre-individuality all different, so it could make a difference of psych individuation. And then secondly, the form or the quality of trans individuality would be different due to the different associated milieu, or due to the nature or difference of nature of milieu, something like that. So I thought of like a dice overthrow, like the word or the human society or human community is not all the accumulation of the, like, it's not mathematics, but there could be something unexpected. So that could be due to like something we can't like calculate like a math, but it could be some kind of it's totally Nietzschean, but the dice of like a, which it could be the result of a trans individuality or difference of the pre-individuality, something like that.
Yeah, I think that the notion of the unexpected is an important one. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because this level of the trans individual or the collective is precisely something that is invented or created rather than something that that is sort of already given. So in the same way that the disparation of the two retinal images requires something like an invention of a new dimension, so that you have a depth, an experience of the world as possessing depth. So in the same way, the collective individuation is an invention of something new rather than something that is already given in what exists prior to the collective individuation. And so it's because of that it has to sort of descend into the pre-individual first. So we have these already constituted living individuals, which are also psychic individuals, but they have to sort of reach back into the pre-individual and draw on the pre-individual in order to bring about something new, which is the invention of the collective. It's something unexpected. It's not something that you can just sort of predict based on like adding up all of the. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. The conception that he's sort of rejecting here is the idea that you can sort of measure a bunch of different qualities of all the already existing individuals and sort of like, I don't know, do like personality tests on everyone and then just sort of add up all those results and then give something like a prediction of what the collective is going to look like after that. And Simondon is rejecting that because there's something like this capacity to invent a new collectivity is always inherent in it's already inherent in psychic individuation that this capacity for an invention of something beyond psychic individuation is possible. Yeah, that unpredictability or that novelty, I think, is a key feature of the collective individuation.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for the question. That was a really insightful question, I think. And then there's also a question in the chat from TL again. Do we think of traditions in a social group as trans-individuated? Specific people have natality, the non-immortality that Simondon refers to, but the traditions themselves individuate as a collective activity and seemingly transcend the physical death of the group's individual members. Yeah, I think that would probably depend on which traditions in particular we're talking about, because certain traditions are or certain traditions would have to do with the differentiation of society into different functional roles. So a society in the proper sense, rather than the collective, which is this homogeneity or this universality of the human individual. So certain traditions. One example I'm thinking of now is the caste relationship in Indian society. Traditionally had to do with differentiation into different employment categories. Like you'd have a caste of metal workers or a caste of I don't know, shoemakers or whatever. and it's not purely by accident that biologists use the word caste for the different roles of insects in a hive, because there's that same sort of differentiation into different functional roles exists in both cases in insect societies and in human societies that are differentiated in this way. Some traditions like that would correspond to or would be part of society as that in a specific sense. Simondon uses that term rather than the collective. But I think it's possible that there could be something like a tradition that corresponds to the collective, to collective activity. So maybe something like that. I think maybe Simondon would see science as something like a tradition that that is a collective activity. In science, we subordinate ourselves to the collective project of knowledge of the world. So we don't, to do science, you have to sort of, you have to make your results public for one thing. And you have to sort of add to the collective total knowledge of humanity. And the results of that work survive beyond the physical lifespan or the vital individuation of you as a living being. But so if you do make a contribution to human knowledge, it's something that survives beyond you insofar as other people continue to carry out science and to advance that tradition of human knowledge. And yeah, something like an artistic movement, I think, would also fit the same idea as a collective activity. So that by carrying on the work of a founder or a founding group or whatever, you sort of keep alive a tradition as a collective activity, which is something greater than just a series of individual entities or individual living beings sort of added together. Yeah, and then Angus was asking about whether something like the disciplinary society is a collective in the Simondonian sense. So yeah, it does involve the constitution of subjects, which would be a process of individuation, but maybe we can think of it as differentiation into functional roles and therefore inter-individual. So I would actually say I would say therefore societal. So it's the differentiation into functional roles is characteristic of society. So something like the disciplinary society. So you're thinking of there's a text on the societies of control and the way that he characterizes disciplinary societies there, and drawing on Foucault. Yeah, so disciplinary societies have this relationship to individuals, or they constitute their members as individual subjects in this particular sense, and in a way that previous and later social formations don't necessarily do. Yeah, I think. So like Deleuze comes up with this concept of individuals in the societies of control, which would be something distinct from an individual, and a new form of social organization in which there isn't something like a formation of subjects in the way that there is in the disciplinary society. Yeah, I think something like the formation of subjects that Foucault talks about is a little bit different than the individuation that Simondon is describing. So I think the disciplinary society would correspond to the social in the particular sense of Simondon. So it's institutions like the army or the factory or the school and so on that Foucault analyzes have this role in forming a subject to fulfill a certain functional role. So they institute certain behaviors in a subject and form that person as a subject having a certain relationship to those functional roles. And so I think that the disciplinary society would be something that would fall under the category of society, as Simondon uses that term, rather than as collective. Okay, so I think we can go on to section 2 of this chapter. So would someone else like to read the next page or so?
Life can exist without individuals being anatomically and physiologically or merely physiologically separate from one another. Let's consider the coelenterate as a type of this kind of existence in the animal kingdom. These beings are characterized by the fact that they have no general cavity. The cavity that hollows out their body and expands into more or less complicated canals is a digestive cavity. Their symmetry is radial, since their organs are mirrored around the axis that passes through their mouth. The majority of coelenterates are apt to bud and form colonies. Individuals formed by this budding are called blastozoids, and they can remain in communication with the initial being, which is called an oozoid because it hatches from an egg. Corals, hydroids, and gorgonians form extremely numerous colonies. However, continuous formations can appear between individuals, thus constituting a solid material unity of the colony. This is what is seen in polyps joined together in a colony. The coenochym fills the spaces that separate individuals. This deposit of limestone, whether compact or spongy, deprives the polyp of its branchy form and gives it a massive aspect. Individuals will no longer appear except through their calyces, which are open on the level of the colony's shared surface. A coenosarc then joins the individuals of the same colony, giving birth to new individuals through budding and by secreting the coenochym. In certain colony formations, the individuals manifest a differentiation that winds up in some sense transforming them into organs. Some have a nutritive role, others have a defensive role, while others have a sexual role, and it could be claimed in some sense that veritable individuality is transferred to the colony if an impregnable residue of individuality didn't remain in the differentiated beings that compose the colony, namely the absence of synchronization in particular births and deaths. Temporally, there remains a distinction between individuals that is not cancelled out by the high degree of interdependence of their complementary relations. Certainly, it could be said that in a superior organism, there are particular births and deaths of cells, but what is born and dies without synchronization in this superior animal is not the organ but the constituent of the organ, elementary cell. I would like to show that the criterion that allows for the recognition of real individuality here is not the material and spatial bond or separation of beings in a society or a colony, but the possibility of life apart and of migration outside the first biological unit. The difference between an organism and a colony is the fact that the individuals of a colony can die one after another and be replaced without jeopardizing the colony. What constitutes individuality is non-immortality. Each individual can be treated as a quantum of living existence. Conversely, the colony does not possess this quantum characteristic. In some sense, it is continuous in its development and its existence. What makes individuality remarkable is that thanatological nature. Because of this, it should be said that amoebae, as well as a large number of infusoria, are not strictly speaking veritable individuals. These beings are capable of regeneration by exchanging one nucleus with another being. And after a period of time, they can reproduce by dividing into two parts. Certain holothuria can also divide into a plurality of segments when conditions of life become poor, each segment afterwards reconstituting a complete unit, i.e. a holothuria similar to the previous cat entity. In this case, and properly speaking, there is no distinction between the individuals and the species. Individuals do not die but divide. Individuality can only appear with the death of beings. Death is the correlate of individuality. The study of pre-individual life has a theoretical interest, since the passage from these pre-individual systems of existence to individual systems allows us to grasp the correlate or correlates of individuation and their biological signification. In particular, the vast domain of coelenterates reveals a transitional zone between non-individuated life systems and totally individuated systems. The study of these mixed types makes it possible to establish valuable functional equivalences between individuated systems and non-individuated systems on the same level of biological organization and in somewhat equivalent circumstances, either in the same species or from one species to another closely related species.
Angus has posted some explanations in the chat of some of these biological terms. So these are mostly different types of invertebrate organisms, and then also some microorganisms. So what is interesting, or what Simondon is pointing to with these types of living beings, is that they have this non-individuality about them. So whereas properly speaking, individuated beings are born and die, something like an amoeba, it's not born and it doesn't die. It's the product of a division of a previous amoeba, and it itself undergoes division into further amoebae. So it's potentially immortal. You can have the existing amoeba today is the descendant cell from amoeba, however many millions and billions of years ago. It's just one continuous stream of amoeba division through that time period. So there's in this sense there isn't something like an individuation of the amoeba. It's and you can also in the case of the amoeba, there's the capacity for two individual cells to fuse together or to exchange material. So there's this sort of provisional individuation of the amoeba. It is only provisional, so it can always be absorbed into a further into another individual and undergo differentiation into future individuals. So there's only something like a provisional or a quasi-individuation in this case, rather than individuation in the proper sense of the term. And we also find this in corals, where they form this something like a colony. So they share a circulatory system between. You have what is, to some extent, an individual with its own mouth, and it's capable of acting in a somewhat independent manner from the rest of the colony. But they share a circulatory system so that the nutrients that one mouth absorbs are circulated throughout the whole colony. And there's also within the colony, there can be something like a differentiation of the different members into something similar to the organs of an organism, so that you have some of the individuals specialize in nutrition, and others specialize in defending the colony, and so on. But what differentiates what is the criterion or the sign that that these differentiated individual corals are not fully to be identified with organs, is the fact that they live and die independently of each other. So one coral can die, and the rest of the colony will still survive. Whereas in living individuals, you don't have this unsynchronized birth and death of organs. So the in say even something like a worm or something like that, it has individual organs within its body, that are formed as it develops, and their development of those organs is synchronized with the development of the organism as a whole, and so you don't have something like the unsynchronized birth and death of organs within an organism in the way that you have unsynchronized birth and death of corals within a colony. So there's so you do have in organisms, you have the birth and death of cells in this unsynchronized way, but those are components of the organs rather than the organs themselves. So this this requires a differentiation into three levels. So you have the level of the organism, the level of the organ, which is preserved throughout the lifespan of the organism, and then you have the level of the cell, which in which the cells die and are replaced in each of the organs. And whereas the colony is only divided up into two levels, so there's the level of the colony and the level of the member of the colony, but and then the even though the level of the members of the colony, they're functionally differentiated, they aren't integrated through their synchronization of their birth and death with the lifespan of the colony in the way that the organs in an organism are. And I think one point that I think is interesting here is the way that so Simon Dohm introduces this idea or this assertion that death is the correlate of individuation, of individuality. But here, this is something which is completely different. Is a completely different understanding of the relationship between death and individuation than in Heidegger, for example. It's a completely biological understanding of the role of death in individuation, which is something that Heidegger, of course, would reject. So I think it's interesting that you have in both cases you have this relationship between death and individuation, but in a completely different sense or a completely different usage of that relationship. Yeah, and then there's a question in the chat about from TL. So how do we think about the non-living part of the colony, such as the bee's hive, which is integral to the formation of the hive? Yeah, that's a good question. I think to the extent that something like this non-living element is essential to the functioning of the colony. I think to that extent it differentiates it from a living being or from an organism in the sense of an individual. So in an individual organism, the functioning of that organism is dependent on the living. It's like sort of a self-sustaining living system in the sense that it doesn't incorporate something non-living in its functioning in general. I'm thinking of maybe some exceptions to that would be something like a hermit crab, for example, that takes shells of other organisms and lives inside them and incorporates it into its functioning. So maybe that's not entirely true. Maybe we can think of it as Ollie suggested in the chat, as something like a milieu. So a living organism always has a relationship to a milieu, and the bee's hive or the hermit crab's shell is maybe like a portion of that milieu, like the most immediate portion of that milieu that the organism brings about itself, so that it constructs its own milieu in that narrow sense. And there's a sort of domain of research in biology called niche construction, which has to do with the way that organisms modify their environment and then are in turn modified by that modified environment, so that bees, for example, have evolved in such a way that they produce hives, and the continued evolution of bees is sort of presupposes an environment in which there are beehives, and likewise you have beavers that produce dams that produce these beaver ponds that they live in, and so part of the environment in which beavers evolve is an environment in which you have existing beaver dams. So yeah, there's this sort of reciprocal relationship between the organism and its environment. Yeah, so, and then TL has commented, the hive seems as much a part of the associated milieu of the individual bee as another bee is to that bee, but for the collective of the colony, it seems different in some way. So you're saying that the relationship of one bee to the non-living environment, in the sense the bee's hive is different than the relationship of the total group of bees to the hive. Yeah, I think that's true, in the sense that the individual bee is born and lives in an environment in which the hive already exists. The collective, whereas the collective of bees as a whole has to produce its own hive, and so the individual bee can have the hive as a sort of given environment in which it's born and lives, whereas the collective of all, or the society of all the bees doesn't have the hive given as a part of its environment. It has to actually create it. But yeah, I'm not too sure what that difference, what the sort of upshot of that difference is, or what significance that difference has for Simondon's theory. That's an interesting question. Okay, we can probably do one more page, and then we'll have to end for the day. So if someone else would like to read from, where are we? The top of 182, I think.
An interesting point that deserves to be noted before a general study is the following. Sexual reproduction seems most directly associated with the individual thanatological characteristic starting from this very level. Colonies of, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, coelenterates, in certain cases lay eggs that produce jellyfish, and reproduction is guaranteed by these jellyfish. But in certain cases, an entire individual detaches from the colony and it will lay eggs much later after having led a detached life and then die, whereas a new colony is founded by the budding of a source individual that emerges from this egg. Thus, a free individual exists, having the capacity to die between two colonies capable of an indefinite development in time. Here, with respect to the colonies, the individual plays a role of transductive propagation. In its birth, it emanates from a colony, and before its death, it generates the starting point for a new colony after a certain displacement in time and space. Part of a colony, it is inserted between two colonies without being integrated in either. In both its birth and its end, reach an equilibrium to the extent that it emanates from one community but engenders another. It is relation. However, such a function is very difficult to perceive on the superior and highly differentiated level, because the individual in the individuated forms of life systems is in fact a mixture. Two things are taken up in it: the nature of pure individuality, comparable to what is seen at work in the relation between two colonies, and the nature of continuous life, which corresponds to the function of organized simultaneity, such as we see it at work in a colony. The drives of the individual and its tendencies define the distinction between these two functions that may not be represented together in the individual. The drives are indeed relative to the pure individual, insofar as the latter is what transmits vital activity through space and time. Conversely, the continuous and everyday tendencies do not possess this irreversible aspect of creative nature that the drives define through successive stinging blows, which displace the constituted individual and can be in contradiction with its tendencies. Tendencies involve the common and the continuous, since there can easily be a synergy between tendencies shared by a very large number of individuals, whereas drives can be more atypical insofar as they correspond to a transfer function of the individual and not to an integration into the vital community. Drives can even be seemingly devitalizing precisely because they do not belong to the everyday continuity of existence. Drives generally reveal themselves by way of their characteristic as consequences without premises. They introduce a transductive dynamism that borrows nothing from the continuity of the tendencies and that can even inhibit it. Human communities build up a whole defense system against the instinctual drives by seeking to define tendencies and drives in univocal terms as if they shared the same nature. This is where the error comes from. If tendencies and drives shared the same nature, it becomes possible to distinguish the transductive characteristic from that of belonging to a society. Manifestations of the sexual drive are, for example, treated as testifying to the existence of a tendency, and then we start talking about a sexual need. The development of certain societies perhaps incites the confusion of needs and tendencies in the individual, since the hyperadaptation to communal life can be expressed by the inhibition of drives on behalf of tendencies. It's just all semicolons. Indeed, since tendencies are continuous and therefore stable, they are able to be integrated into communal life and even constitute a means for the integration of the individual, which is incorporated into the community by its nutritive and defensive needs, both of which transform it into a user and a consumer.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things in this passage that are, I think, noteworthy. So this notion of the individual as being between two colonies, or being this intermediate, which plays the role of the structural germ in the case of physical individuation. So you have these colonies that from which an individual is detached in the form of something like a jellyfish, and it sort of floats around and has its own existence as an individual, and then it lays eggs that that hatch and produce a new colony through budding. So there's two different modes of reproduction of these species. So they can either reproduce through budding and in their colony form, or they can reproduce through laying eggs in their individual form. And the individual can it hatches from an egg, and it floats around and does its thing for a while, and then it dies. So there's a real individuality of this jellyfish form, and whereas the colony has this only sort of quasi-individuality of the members of the colony that are born and die independently of each other, but are otherwise integrated in the sense that they have a shared circulatory system and so on. And then so the individual in the case of what Simondon here calls higher animals, or higher, what we can think of as more precisely individuated or more definitively individuated beings. So in this case, the individual plays both roles at the same time. So there's that individuality in the sense of what exists in between the two colony stages. So that this individual that has this transductive role, and then there's also something like the colony form at the same time. So living beings in this kind of organization play both roles at the same time, and he wants to distinguish between the two different notions of drives and tendencies as corresponding to the two roles of the individual as the pure individual that exists between colony forms and the colony form of the individual. And so we have drives which are relative to the pure individual, so that they have to do with this transductive process, and then tendencies that would be part of the colony existence or the everyday existence of living beings. So drives have to do with the way that an individual serves as a relay for reproduction, and then tendencies have to do with the sort of everyday existence of the organism. And so we have to make this distinction between the two. And also, we also have to distinguish between them in the sense that they are incorporated into the group in a different way, so that the tendencies of individuals can be sort of coherent or have this synergy between them. So in the way that we can see in social animals, including humans, we have this sort of those beings have a tendency or some sort of predisposition towards living with each other and cooperating and doing things together in various ways. So that's the side of the tendencies, whereas the drives would be something that is extra social in a way, or that is external to that social organization of those animals. And they can sometimes sort of disrupt the organization of social life and the everyday existence of a living being. So you can think of animals that, like I'm thinking of salmon that swim thousands of kilometers and go upstream and to reproduce and die. So their whole existence, their everyday existence, is completely disrupted by this drive towards reproduction. Yeah, so there's this distinction that we have to make, and there's a confusion between the two, which we have to avoid, which comes about through the way that certain human societies, what he's thinking of here, I think, human societies have some sort of hyper adaptation to communal life, which is takes the form of an inhibition of drives in favor of tendencies. So an inhibition of that transductive power or capacity of the individual in favor of that colony or collective form of the individual. Sorry, I should say social form of the individual.
Simone is trying to differentiate the drives from drives and tendency. So my understanding here is like a tendency is like referring to it's referred to as some kind of something collective, and then drives is something individual. But maybe like next week, like we can talk more because like a Freudian drives is coming up. And
yeah, I think it would be good to come back to this concept because so he does mention Freud just below where we stopped, and he's going to talk about Freud's theory of drives and his criticism of it, so we can come back to that concept. The only thing I would sort of say that is that collective is the term that Simondon uses specifically for that trans-individual form of a group, whereas I think what he has in mind in connection with the tendencies is more like a society, like the colony form of the coelenterates, so that they have this functional differentiation into different quasi-individuals, but they are sort of joined together, and so they have only this quasi-individuality. That's where the tendencies fall onto that side. Yeah, I think that's a good place to stop for today, so that we can pick up from that after that long series of semicolons on page 183, and we'll look at this theory of drives and tendencies in more detail. So thank you everyone for your questions and contributions, and see you all next week.